The day my father died was the day I lost my bedroom, my dignity, and my place in my own home. My stepmother wasted no time relegating me to the unfinished basement while her precious children divided my sunlit room between them. 10 years later, as I stood in the doorway of my beautiful lakeside home watching her struggle with her suitcases, I wondered if karma had finally come to collect its debt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon my father's will was read still burns in my memory like a scar that never quite healed. I was 16, dressed in the only black dress I owned, sitting in our family attorney's office beside my stepmother, Diane, and her twin children, Marcus and Madison. The twins were 14 then, a fact Diane never failed to mention when explaining why they needed more space than I did. My name is Emma Reynolds, and at 16, I became an afterthought in my own home. The home my birth mother had designed, before cancer took her when I was 8. The home where Dad and I had lived happily until he met Diane at a school fundraiser when I was 12. Mr. Abernathy, our family attorney since before I was born, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. As per the last will and testament of Richard James Reynolds, the family residence at 247 Oakwood Drive shall remain in joint ownership between his wife, Diane Reynolds, and his daughter, Emma Reynolds, until such time as Emma reaches the age of 25, at which point full ownership will transfer to Emma exclusively. The room went silent. I stared at Mr. Abernathy, certain I had misheard. Dad had never mentioned leaving the house to me. Beside me, Diane's body tensed like a coiled spring. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice tight. "Richard and I discussed this. The house was supposed to transfer to me, with provisions for Emma's college expenses." Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "I assure you, Mrs. Reynolds, there is no mistake. Mr. Reynolds was very clear about his wishes when we updated his will last year after his diagnosis. The house goes to Emma when she turns 25. Until then, you have joint ownership with all the legal protections that provides for your continued residence there." I remembered Dad's diagnosis all too clearly. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive, and merciless. The doctors had given him a year at most. He'd made it 11 months and 2 weeks, slipping away on a Tuesday morning while I sat beside his hospital bed working on calculus homework, because he'd insisted I not fall behind. "And the investment accounts?" Diane asked, leaning forward. "The Morgan Stanley account, valued at approximately $340,000, is to be held in trust for Emma's education and basic needs until she turns 25, at which point any remaining funds transfer to her control. The Fidelity account, approximately $175,000, goes to you, Mrs. Reynolds, along with the full balance of life insurance proceeds." I barely registered the financial details. All I could think about was that Dad had ensured I would eventually have our family home, the last place where memories of both my parents lived. The drive back to Oakwood Drive was silent and tense. Marcus and Madison sat in the back seat with me, exchanging nervous glances as their mother white-knuckled the steering wheel. I stared out the window, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past, wondering what would happen next. I didn't have to wonder long. "We need to discuss bedroom arrangements," Diane announced that evening after a dinner of reheated lasagna dropped off by a neighbor. "With your father gone, it makes sense to reorganize things." I looked up from my barely touched food. "What do you mean?" "The twins are getting older. They need more space. Marcus can't keep sleeping in that converted office. It's barely big enough for his bed and desk." I nodded cautiously. Dad had converted his home office into a bedroom when Diane and the twins moved in. Madison had taken the guest room while I kept my childhood bedroom, the largest of the three with its bay window and window seat where I spent countless hours reading. "I thought maybe we could convert the basement," Diane continued. "It's actually quite spacious. With some work, it could make a lovely bedroom for you. More privacy, your own entrance. Like a little apartment. The basement was unfinished except for a small laundry area. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, and a ceiling so low that Dad had to duck his head in certain spots. It flooded slightly during heavy rains and housed enough spiders to populate a small nature preserve. You want me to move to the basement, so Madison and Marcus can have my room? My voice sounded small even to my own ears. We're all making sacrifices, Emma. I'm trying to do what's best for everyone. But that's my room. It's always been my room. Diane's expression hardened. This is difficult for all of us. Your father would want us to make practical decisions. The twins need the space now, and you'll have the whole house in a few years. Anyway. The unfairness burned in my chest, but what could I do? I was 16, legally still a minor with nowhere else to go. My mother's parents had passed away years before, and Dad's mother lived in a memory care facility states away. I had no siblings, no aunts or uncles willing to take me in. The basement conversion happened with alarming speed. A carpet remnant covered a portion of the concrete floor. A second-hand bed, my existing dresser, and desk were arranged in what Diane called a bedroom area. A shower curtain suspended from the ceiling pipes created a makeshift changing area beside the laundry sink. My bookshelves remained upstairs. No space for them down here, and books would just get damp anyway. Within a week, Madison had moved into my bedroom. The pale blue walls I had helped Dad paint when I was 10 were quickly covered with posters of boy bands and movie heartthrobs. My window seat, where I had spent countless hours reading and dreaming, became a display area for Madison's collection of stuffed animals. The small adjoining bathroom that had been exclusively mine now featured Marcus's electric razor and acne medications, alongside Madison's makeup collection. I retreated to my basement apartment, bringing with me only what would fit in the reduced space. Each night I fell asleep to the sound of footsteps overhead and the occasional scurrying of what I hoped were just mice. Each morning, I woke to the vibration of the washing machine's spin cycle as Diane started her daily chores. School became my sanctuary. I threw myself into classes, joining every club that would keep me away from home until dinner. I secured a weekend job at the local bookstore, saving every penny. By senior year, I had mapped out my escape. A scholarship to State University, 3 hours away, far enough that coming home on weekends would be impractical. The irony wasn't lost on me that Diane's neglect had inadvertently spurred my academic success. Without a comfortable home environment, I had channeled all my energy into school and work. I graduated valedictorian with a full scholarship that covered not just tuition, but room and board as well. As I packed my meager belongings the summer after graduation, Diane appeared at the bottom of the basement stairs. "You know you can always come back on breaks," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. It was the closest thing to warmth she had shown me in years. I nodded, knowing I had no intention of returning for more than brief, obligatory visits. Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. University life was a revelation. My dorm room, though small and shared with a stranger, felt luxurious compared to the basement. I had a real bed, proper lighting, and no one questioning my comings and goings. My roommate, Layla, came from a large, boisterous family and seemed genuinely interested in my well-being. A novel concept after years with Diane and the twins. I called home dutifully once a month, brief conversations that neither Diane nor I seemed to enjoy. The twins, now in high school themselves, rarely came to the phone. I returned for Christmas that first year, sleeping in my basement room that had been undisturbed in my absence. The visit lasted 3 uncomfortable days before I invented a research project that required my early return to campus. By sophomore year, I had secured a resident advisor position that provided a private room and stipend. By junior year, I had enough credits to graduate early, and by 21, I had earned a master's degree in architectural design and secured a position with a prestigious firm in a city 2 states away. Through it all, I kept careful track of the passage of time. 9 years until the house would be mine. 8. 7. The countdown became a quiet mantra that sustained me through difficult projects and demanding clients. I returned to Oakwood. Drive only for the briefest of visits. Once when Madison got married in a lavish ceremony that seemed beyond Diane's financial means, and again when Marcus graduated from college. Each time, I slept in the same basement room, now occasionally used for storage, but still recognizably my teenage prison. Diane never asked about my life, and I volunteered little. She knew I had some job in architecture, but showed no interest in the details. The twins, absorbed in their own lives, treated me with the distant politeness reserved for an acquaintance rather than a stepsister they had grown up with. As my 25th birthday approached, I consulted with Mr. Abernathy about the transfer of the house. He confirmed that everything was in order. The trust had covered my education with funds to spare, and the house would legally become mine on my birthday. "What are your plans for the property?" he asked during one of our calls. "I haven't decided yet," I answered truthfully. Part of me wanted to sell it immediately, severing all ties with the place that held so many painful memories. Another part remained stubbornly attached to the home my mother had loved, where I had once been happy. What I didn't mention to Mr. Abernathy was the decision looming before me: what to do about Diane and her continued residence in my house. Legally, I could evict her. Morally, the question was more complicated. 2 months before my 25th birthday, as autumn leaves began to turn, I took a week off work and returned to my hometown. It was time to confront the past and decide my future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The familiar scent of cinnamon and apples greeted me when I pushed open the front door of my childhood home. Diane had always baked when she was anxious, a trait I had forgotten in my years away. The house looked smaller somehow. The once spacious foyer now cluttered with shoes and jackets that didn't belong to anyone I recognized. "Emma, is that you?" Diane's voice floated from the kitchen, followed by the woman herself, wiping flour-covered hands on an apron I remembered from my teenage years. She had aged considerably since I'd last seen her at Marcus's graduation 2 years prior. Her once auburn hair now showed significant gray, and new lines framed her eyes and mouth. She looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't conceal. "I wasn't expecting you until next month," she said, the slight tremor in her voice betraying her discomfort. We both knew what my upcoming birthday signified. "I took some time off work," I replied, setting down my suitcase. "I thought it would be good to spend a week here before everything changes." Diane nodded stiffly, her eyes darting away from mine. "Well, your room is available, of course." "My room?" I couldn't keep the bitter edge from my voice. "You mean the basement?" She flinched slightly. "I've made some improvements over the years. New carpet, proper lighting. Marcus helped me install drywall on 2 of the walls before he moved to Boston." I followed her down the familiar stairs, bracing myself for the damp, musty space that had been my teenage prison. To my surprise, the basement had indeed undergone significant renovations. The concrete floor was now completely covered with gray carpet, and 2 of the walls had been properly finished. A proper bed had replaced my old twin mattress, and someone had installed track lighting along the ceiling beams. It was still unmistakably a basement, but it looked more like an actual living space than the makeshift arrangement I'd endured years ago. "It's better," I acknowledged, setting my bag on the bed. "Thank you." Diane lingered awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs. I always meant to finish it properly. There just never seemed to be enough money after putting the twins through college. I bit back the obvious response, that my education had been funded by my father's foresight, not her sacrifice. Instead, I simply nodded and began unpacking my suitcase. "There's apple crisp upstairs when you're ready," she said before retreating up the stairs. Alone in the improved but still unmistakably subterranean space, I took stock of my emotions. The anger I had nurtured for nearly a decade felt muted now, tempered by distance and my own hard-won success. Diane seemed smaller somehow, diminished, by time and circumstances I didn't yet understand. After unpacking, I ventured upstairs to find Diane sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't asked aloud. "Where are the twins these days?" I asked, serving myself a portion of apple crisp that smelled exactly as I remembered. "Madison lives in Chicago with her husband. They're expecting their first child in December." Diane's face softened at this news. "Marcus took a job with a tech company in Boston after graduation. He's been there about 18 months now." I nodded, taking a bite of the dessert. "And you? Are you still working at the elementary school?" A shadow crossed her face. "No, I had to leave that position last year. Budget cuts. I've been doing substitute teaching and some tutoring, but it's not steady." That explained the new tension lines around her mouth, the slightly shabby look of her clothes that I hadn't noticed initially. Teaching assistants weren't well paid to begin with, and substitute work would be even less reliable. "I see," I said, unsure what else to offer. "I'm sorry to hear that." Diane looked up then, really meeting my eyes for the first time. "Emma, I know we need to discuss what happens next month, with the house." I set down my fork, the sweetness of the apple, crisp turning to ash in my mouth. "Yes, we do. I've been looking at apartments," she continued, her voice carefully controlled. "There's a complex near the community college that's reasonable. I should be able to afford it if I can pick up more tutoring hours." The image of Diane in some impersonal apartment complex, alone and struggling to make ends meet, created an unexpected twist of discomfort in my chest. Despite everything, she was the woman my father had chosen to love after my mother. She had raised me, however imperfectly, during my formative teenage years. "There's no rush," I found myself saying. "We can figure out a transition plan that works for both of us." Relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by what looked like shame. "That's very generous, considering everything." An uncomfortable silence settled between us, years of unspoken grievances and hurts filling the space like invisible smoke. I was saved from responding by the sharp ring of the doorbell. Diane startled, checking her watch. I wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the front door, a man in a dark suit stood on the porch, his expression professionally neutral as he asked, "Mrs. Diane Reynolds?" "Yes, that's me." He handed her an envelope. "You've been officially served. Have a good day, ma'am." Diane stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the envelope as the man walked back to his car. I approached cautiously as she finally closed the door. "What is it?" I asked. With shaking hands, she tore open the envelope and scanned the contents. The color drained from her face as she sank into the nearest chair. "It's a lawsuit from Madison's in-laws. They're suing me for the money I borrowed for the wedding." "You borrowed money for Madison's wedding?" I asked, confused. I thought Brian's parents paid for everything. The wedding had been elaborate, held at an exclusive country club with no expense spared. Diane laughed hollowly. "That was the story we told everyone. The truth is, they agreed to loan me the money when my credit cards were maxed out. I was supposed to repay them when—" She trailed off, looking away. "When you got the house," I finished for her, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. She nodded miserably. "I thought I'd be able to take equity out or sell it outright. I never told them about the terms of Richard's will. And now they're taking legal action because I've missed the last 3 payments." "How much do you owe them?" I asked quietly. $47,000, she whispered, the number hanging in the air between us like a physical presence. I sat down across from her, trying to process this information. The woman who had relegated me to a basement for years had apparently gone into significant debt to provide her daughter with a fairy tale wedding, counting on a house that was never truly hers to finance it. "Does Madison know?" I asked. Diane shook her head. She and Brian think his parents covered everything as a gift. I couldn't bear for her to know the truth. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I've made so many mistakes, Emma. So many poor decisions." Before I could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and visibly tensed. "It's the school district. I need to take this. It might be a substitute assignment for tomorrow." I nodded and walked to the living room, giving her privacy for the call. The house looked different now that I was seeing it through adult eyes. The furniture showed significant wear. The once pristine hardwood floors desperately needed refinishing, and the paint had faded unevenly on the walls exposed to sunlight. This wasn't the immaculately maintained home of my childhood, but a house in gentle decline due to financial constraints. When Diane joined me a few minutes later, her expression was even more strained than before. "Bad news?" I asked. "They're eliminating the substitute pool for the rest of the semester due to budget constraints. They're consolidating classes instead." She sank onto the couch. That was my most reliable income. Within the span of 30 minutes, I had watched my stepmother's already precarious life crumble further. The woman sitting across from me now bore little resemblance to the confident, sometimes callous figure who had shaped my teenage years. This Diane was vulnerable, defeated, and clearly at the end of her financial and emotional rope. "What will you do?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "I honestly don't know. The timing couldn't be worse." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But that's not your problem, Emma. I've never been your problem, despite making you mine for all those years." The raw honesty of her statement caught me off guard. It was perhaps the closest thing to an acknowledgement of her past treatment that she had ever offered. "I have a week before I need to head back to work," I said carefully. "Maybe we can use that time to figure out some options for you." Diane looked at me with genuine surprise. "Why would you help me after everything?" It was a fair question, one I wasn't entirely sure I had an answer for. The girl who had been banished to the basement had every right to walk away, to let Diane face the consequences of her choices alone. But the woman I had become in the intervening years recognized something in Diane's current predicament that resonated with my own past vulnerability. "Because holding on to anger is exhausting," I finally said. "And because Dad would have wanted me to." That night, alone in my basement room, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. I had few pictures from my high school years, a time I had largely tried to forget, but I did have several from before that period. Dad and me fishing at the lake, Dad helping me build a science project, Dad and Diane at their wedding, both looking genuinely happy. I paused on that last image. I had taken it myself, reluctantly serving as their impromptu wedding photographer when the hired professional was delayed. Diane had been different then, kinder, more patient, less obviously preferential toward the twins. What had changed her? Or had that version of her always been an illusion, a temporary mask worn to secure her position in our family? As I drifted toward sleep, I realized that the next week would reveal far more than just what to do about the house. It would show me what kind of person I had become, whether the basement years had hardened me beyond redemption, or whether I could find a path forward that honored my father's memory without perpetuating the cycle of hurt. The house would legally be mine in less than 2 months. What I would do with that power remained to be seen. Morning light filtered weakly through the small basement windows, casting elongated rectangles across my bed. For a disorienting moment, I felt 16 again, waking, up in my subterranean exile, dreading the day ahead. Then reality reasserted itself. I was 24, successful in my own right, and the woman who had consigned me to this space was now facing her own precarious future. I found Diane at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, bills, bank statements, and what appeared to be collection notices. She hastily gathered them when she saw me, stuffing them into a folder with embarrassment evident in her quick movements. "I made coffee," she offered, gesturing toward the pot. "Still take it black?" I nodded, surprised she remembered this small detail about me. "Thanks. Mind if I join you?" She hesitated, then pushed the folder aside. Of course not. I poured myself a cup and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the gentle tick of the antique wall clock that had been my mother's favorite piece, one of the few things in the house that remained unchanged from my earliest memories. "I need to understand your full situation if I'm going to help," I finally said. "The lawsuit, the job loss, the house, all of it." Diane stared into her coffee cup as if gathering courage. "It's not a pretty picture." "I didn't expect it would be." She sighed deeply, then opened the folder and began arranging papers in front of her. "After your father died, things were tight but manageable. His life insurance covered the immediate expenses and gave us a small cushion. I had my teaching assistant job, which didn't pay much but came with health benefits for all of us." I nodded, remembering the detailed financial provisions in Dad's will. "And the Fidelity account?" Mr. Abernathy said it was worth around $175,000. A flash of guilt crossed her face. "That's gone. Most of it went to the twins' college tuition. Their scholarships covered only about half the costs, and She paused. "I wanted them to have the full university experience, living on campus, not working part-time like I did," I finished for her. "Even with my full scholarship, I'd worked 20 hours a week to cover textbooks, meals outside the dining hall, and other expenses." "Go on." "The rest went to keeping up the house, medical bills when Marcus needed surgery for his ACL tear, and—" She hesitated again. "Madison's wedding," I guessed. She nodded miserably. "The initial deposit, at least. When the Fidelity account was depleted, that's when I turned to credit cards, and eventually to Brian's parents." I glanced at the papers, spread between us, credit card statements showing balances well into 5 figures each, utility bills with past due notices, and medical bills stamped "Final Notice." "What about your own retirement accounts? Savings?" Diane laughed bitterly. "School district teaching assistants don't exactly get generous retirement packages. What little I had saved went to emergency home repairs 3 years ago when the basement flooded." She looked up at me. "Ironically, I was trying to make your old room more livable. I always told myself I'd make it up to you somehow, fix it properly." The basement flooding had happened during my senior year of college. I remembered Diane's brief clinical phone call informing me that some of my remaining belongings had been damaged. By then, I'd taken everything of value with me, leaving behind only childhood memorabilia I hadn't yet sorted through. "And now?" I asked, redirecting the conversation to the present. "Now I'm $94,000 in debt, unemployed, being sued, and about to lose my home." Her matter-of-fact tone couldn't quite mask the tremor in her voice. "At 52, I'll be starting over with nothing." The enormity of her situation settled over me. Whatever resentment I still harbored toward Diane, I wouldn't wish this kind of financial catastrophe on anyone. "Have you spoken with the twins about any of this?" She shook her head firmly. "Marcus is just getting established in his career. His entry-level salary barely covers his own expenses in Boston. And Madison—" Her voice softened. "She's focused on the baby coming. I won't burden her with this." Even though a significant portion of this debt was incurred for her benefit, I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "She didn't ask for an expensive wedding," Diane admitted quietly. "That was my choice. I wanted to give her something special, something perfect." She looked away. maybe I was trying to make up for other failures. The implication hung between us, unspoken but clear. Diane had favored her biological children in countless ways throughout my teenage years, showering them with attention, privileges, and now financial support that had left her destitute. Yet she seemed genuinely blind to the connection between her preferential treatment and her current circumstances. "I need some air," I said, standing abruptly. "I'm going for a walk." Outside, autumn had painted the neighborhood in vibrant oranges and reds. I followed the familiar route to Parkside Elementary, where I had attended school until 6th grade. The playground equipment had been upgraded since my time, but the massive oak tree where I'd often eaten lunch with friends still stood sentinel at the edge of the property. I sat on a bench beneath its spreading branches, trying to process everything I'd learned. Part of me, the wounded teenager who had slept in a damp basement while her step-siblings enjoyed sunlit bedrooms, felt a grim satisfaction at Diane's reversal of fortune. There was a poetic justice to her impending homelessness after what she had put me through. But another part of me, the adult who had fought her way to success through determination and hard work, recognized something familiar in Diane's struggle: the fear of an uncertain future, the shame of financial instability, the desperate attempts to maintain appearances while everything crumbled behind the scenes. My phone buzzed with a message from Layla, my college roommate turned best friend. "How's Operation Reclaim Your Childhood Home going? Kicked the evil stepmother to the curb yet?" I smiled, despite myself. Layla had heard all my basement stories during late-night confidences in our dorm room. She had encouraged my countdown to homeownership, championing my right to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But now, faced with the reality rather than the fantasy of revenge, I found myself unexpectedly conflicted. "It's complicated," I typed back. "We'll call you tonight." As I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I noticed a familiar figure approaching. Mrs. Kellerman, my former high school English teacher. Her hair had gone completely silver since I'd last seen her, but her purposeful stride and impeccable posture remained unchanged. "Emma Reynolds," she called, genuine pleasure lighting her face. What a wonderful surprise. We exchanged warm greetings and caught up briefly on our respective lives. She had retired last year after 40 years of teaching, and now volunteered at the community center teaching ESL classes. "I always knew you'd do remarkable things," she said warmly. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become." Would he? The question escaped before I could contain it. Mrs. Kellerman studied me with the perceptive gaze that had made students believe she could read minds. "Something's troubling you." I hesitated, then found myself explaining the situation with Diane in the house, careful to present the facts without editorializing. Mrs. Kellerman had known our blended family well. She had been my advocate during those difficult years, ensuring I had quiet places to study and access to resources Diane often overlooked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, considering. "Your father once told me something I've never forgotten," she finally said. "It was during a parent-teacher conference shortly after he married Diane. I had expressed some concerns about changes I was noticing in your behavior, withdrawal, excessive perfectionism, signs of anxiety." I tensed, wondering what revelation was coming. Richard said, "Grace isn't giving people what they deserve. It's giving them what they need." She smiled gently. He was talking about his approach to blending your families. He acknowledged the challenges, the mistakes being made, but he was committed to extending grace through the process. "He didn't know how bad things would get after he was gone," I said quietly. "No, he didn't," she agreed. "But I wonder what guidance he would offer you now, faced with this moment of decision." The question lingered as we parted ways, Mrs. Kellerman continuing her walk, and me slowly making my way back to the house. My house, according to my father's will, and the impending legal transfer of ownership. When I returned, I found a note. From Diane on the kitchen counter. Gone to meet with an attorney about the lawsuit. There's sandwich fixings in the fridge. Alone in the house, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I went into my father's study. After his death, Diane had converted it into a guest bedroom, but she had preserved his desk and bookshelves in the space. I ran my fingers along the spines of his books, medical references from his career as a pediatrician, classic novels he loved to reread, photo albums meticulously organized by year. I pulled out the album labeled Emma Ages 0-10 and settled into the window seat. Page after page showed a happy child growing up secure in the knowledge she was loved. There I was as a toddler, beaming from my father's shoulders. As a kindergartner, proudly displaying a crayon drawing. As a gap-toothed second grader holding my mother's hand during her final months. Toward the end of the album, I found a photo I'd never seen before. My father and me sitting on our front porch steps, deep in conversation. I couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. On the back, in Dad's neat handwriting, was a note. Teaching Emma about forgiveness after the Tyler incident. She has her mother's compassion beneath her stubbornness. The Tyler incident. I remembered it clearly now, a neighborhood boy who had destroyed my science project the day before it was due. I had been furious, convinced he had ruined my chances at the science fair. Dad had sat me down for a long talk about the difference between justice and revenge, between holding people accountable and helping them become better. I'd forgiven Tyler eventually. We'd even become friends in high school. As I returned the album to its shelf, I realized the challenge before me wasn't simply deciding what to do about the house or about Diane's financial crisis. It was deciding what kind of person I wanted to be, what legacy of my father's values I would carry forward. The easy path would be to claim what was legally mine, to let Diane face the consequences of her choices alone. The harder path. Well, that remained to be seen. But I knew it would require confronting both Diane's failings and my own lingering resentments with equal honesty. When Diane returned later that afternoon, her expression told me everything I needed to know about her meeting with the attorney. Not good? I asked, as she set her purse down heavily on the counter. They won't negotiate. It's the full amount plus legal fees, or they pursue a judgment against me. She looked utterly defeated. The attorney says they could potentially garnish my wages if I had any. I took a deep breath. Sit down, Diane. We need to talk about what happens next. The time had come to transform the challenge into a plan of action, one that would honor my father's legacy while allowing me to reclaim my own power in this house of shadowed memories. Before we start this conversation, Diane said, settling into the kitchen chair across from me, I want you to know that I don't expect you to solve my problems. Her fingers nervously traced the edge of a placemat, a habit I remembered from my teenage years. I made my bed, as they say. I studied her face, the tight lines around her mouth, the shadows beneath her eyes. Despite her words, hope flickered. Behind her carefully neutral expression, she might claim not to expect my help, but she clearly wanted it. Let me be direct, I said, folding my hands on the table. In less than 2 months, this house becomes legally mine. You'll have no ownership stake and no legal right to remain here unless I allow it. She nodded stiffly. I understand that. Your financial situation is dire, and from what you've shown me, there's no clear path to recovery without some form of intervention. I'm aware of how bad things are, Emma, she said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. I didn't plan for things to end up this way. Did you plan for me to spend my teenage years in a basement? The question slipped out before I could stop it, sharper than I'd intended. Diane's eyes widened slightly, then dropped to stare at her hands. That's not the same thing, isn't it? You made decisions that prioritized Madison and Marcus's comfort over mine. Now you're facing the consequences of decisions that prioritized their needs over your financial stability. Her head snapped up. Is that what this is about? You're enjoying seeing me get what you think I deserve? No, I said firmly. But we can't move forward productively if we pretend the past didn't happen. A heavy silence fell between us. Through the kitchen window, I could see the maple tree in the backyard, its leaves a brilliant red against the afternoon sky. Dad had helped me build a treehouse in its branches when I was 7. By the time I was 16, Diane had convinced him to dismantle it to make room for a more mature landscape design. I have a proposal, I finally said. But before I share it, I need you to acknowledge something. Diane tensed visibly. What? That you treated me unfairly during my teenage years. That relegating me to the basement while giving my bedroom to your children was wrong. Her expression cycled through shock, defensiveness, and finally, a reluctant recognition. She opened her mouth as if to offer an explanation, then closed it again. You're right, she said quietly. It was wrong. I hadn't expected her to concede so readily. I'd prepared for denials, for rationalizations about the twins' needs, or the practical considerations of the household. Her simple acknowledgement threw me momentarily off balance. At the time, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I told myself it made sense. The twins could share the bigger room. You were more independent. The basement gave you privacy. She shook her head. But the truth is, I favored my biological children. I didn't consciously set out to hurt you, but I didn't consider your feelings the way I should have. The admission hung in the air between us. Part of me had needed to hear these words for years, a validation that my hurt wasn't just teenage sensitivity or overreaction, but a response to genuine unfairness. Thank you for acknowledging that, I said finally. Here's my proposal. I'll help you address the lawsuit and your financial situation, but in exchange, I want complete honesty and transparency going forward. Diane's expression shifted from resignation to cautious hope. What exactly are you proposing? First, I need to see everything. Every debt, every account, every financial obligation. No more hiding bills or downplaying the situation. She nodded slowly. Okay. Second, I want you to reach out to Madison and Marcus. They need to understand the reality of your situation, especially since some of this debt was incurred for their benefit. This suggestion met with immediate resistance. They can't help financially. This isn't about them paying your debts, I interrupted. It's about honesty within the family. The same honesty you just showed me. Diane looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Madison is pregnant, and she's an adult who should know what's happening with her mother, I said firmly. I'm not suggesting you burden her with responsibility, but continuing to shield them from reality isn't helping anyone. She sighed deeply. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. We have a limited window before my birthday changes the legal ownership of this house. And after your birthday? She asked hesitantly. What happens then? It was the question we'd been circling around. What I planned to do with the house. Once it was legally mine, and by extension, what would happen to Diane. That depends on several factors, I answered carefully, including how the next few weeks go. Diane nodded, accepting the non-answer with surprising grace. So, what's the immediate next step? Tomorrow, we meet with a financial advisor I know who specializes in debt resolution. Tonight, you gather every financial document in this house so we have a complete picture. And the lawsuit? Let me read through the paperwork first. There may be options we haven't considered. As Diane went to collect her financial records, I retreated to the basement to make a phone call. Once alone, I dialed Layla, who answered on the second ring. Finally, I've been dying to know what's happening with Evil Stepmom Showdown 2023. Despite everything, I smiled at her characterization. It's more complicated than I expected. Uh-oh, you're not going soft on her, are you? I sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. Not exactly, but she's in serious financial trouble, Layla. Like, potentially homeless trouble. And this concerns you because she's still my stepmother. Because this was my father's house. Because... I hesitated, trying to articulate the conflicted feelings churning inside me. Because I don't want to become someone who enjoys watching another person suffer, even if that person hurt me. Layla was quiet for a moment. I get it, she said finally. But Emma, you don't owe her salvation. Whatever you decide to do should be because you want to, not out of obligation. I know. I just need to figure out what I actually want. After ending the call, I stared at the basement ceiling, following the pattern of pipes and electrical conduits with my eyes. How many nights had I done exactly this as a teenager, feeling trapped and powerless in this subterranean space? The irony wasn't lost on me that now, on the verge of owning the entire house, I was voluntarily sleeping in the same room. My phone buzzed with a text from Zach, my boyfriend of 8 months. How's the hometown visit going? Miss you. I hesitated, unsure how to condense everything into a text response. Zach knew the broad outlines of my history with Diane, but we hadn't delved deeply into those emotional waters. Our relationship had developed in the present, focused on shared interests in architecture, hiking, and classic films, not on excavating childhood wounds. Complicated, I finally replied. We'll call tomorrow with updates. When I returned, upstairs, Diane had covered the dining room table with stacks of papers, bills, statements, contracts, and handwritten notes. The physical manifestation of her financial disarray was even more overwhelming than I'd anticipated. This is everything, she said, gesturing to the chaos before us. Every debt, every account, every agreement. I nodded, appreciating her thoroughness even as I felt daunted by the task ahead. Let's start organizing by type and priority. For the next 3 hours, we worked side by side, sorting documents into categories: urgent debts, secured loans, credit cards, medical bills, utility payments, and legal obligations. The picture that emerged was grim but finally clear. Diane owed approximately $147,000 across various creditors, with the lawsuit from Madison's in-laws being the most immediately pressing. When did things start to go wrong? I asked as we took a break, both mentally exhausted from the financial archaeology. Diane considered the question, absently twisting a paperclip between her fingers. It was gradual, then sudden, she said. After your father died, I was so afraid of showing any weakness. I wanted the twins to feel secure, to believe everything would be okay. She set the paperclip down. I think I convinced myself as much as them. And me? I couldn't help asking. What did you want me to feel? The question caught her off guard. I suppose I saw you differently. You seemed so self-sufficient, so determined. Even at 16, you had this quiet strength that reminded me of your father. She looked away. It was easier to believe. You didn't need me as much. I was a child who had lost both parents, I said quietly. Of course I needed support. I know that now, she admitted. But then, I think I was overwhelmed by my own grief and fear. Taking care of the twins' emotional needs was familiar territory. Taking care of yours meant acknowledging Richard's absence in a way I wasn't ready to face. Her explanation didn't excuse what had happened, but it offered a window into her mindset that I hadn't considered before. Diane hadn't relegated me to the basement out of pure favoritism, though that had certainly played a role, but also because focusing on her biological children had been her way of coping with her own loss and insecurity. Understanding this, didn't erase the hurt, but it complicated my narrative of her as simply the evil stepmother who had banished me from my rightful place. "We should get some rest," I said, standing up from the table. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As I turned to head back to the basement, Diane called after me. "Emma?" I paused at the doorway. "Yes? Thank you. For being willing to help. Despite everything. You didn't have to come back here at all, let alone try to sort through my mistakes." I nodded, acknowledging her gratitude without verbally accepting it. "Good night, Diane." In the basement, I prepared for bed mechanically, my mind processing everything I'd learned. The financial severity of Diane's situation exceeded even my initial assessment. Without intervention, she would likely face bankruptcy, wage garnishment, if she found employment, and potential homelessness once the house transferred to my name. I had the power to alleviate or exacerbate her crisis. The legal right to the house was definitively mine, but the moral responsibility was less clear-cut. As I lay in bed, staring once again at the basement ceiling, I found myself mentally revisiting a conversation I'd had with Dad during my first year of college. I'd called home during finals week, stressed about an upcoming exam. Dad had offered his usual calm encouragement, then asked about my roommate situation with Layla. "She's fantastic," I'd told him. "We get along really well." "I'm glad," he'd responded, genuine relief in his voice. "You deserve good people in your life, Emma." At the time, I'd taken his comment at face value. Now, years later, I wondered if he'd been acknowledging, in his gentle way, that my home life with Diane and the twins hadn't been what he'd hoped. Had he known about the basement arrangement? Had he understood the dynamics of the household he'd left behind? Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of floating paperwork and basement floods. I woke before dawn, my mind already racing with the tasks ahead. By the time I showered and made my way upstairs, Diane was already in the kitchen making coffee and toast. "I've been thinking," she said as I entered, "about what you said regarding Madison and Marcus." I poured myself coffee, waiting for her to continue. "You're right. They should know what's happening." She set a plate of toast on the table. "I'll call them both today." It was a small concession, but an important one. An acknowledgement that honesty, however uncomfortable, was necessary for moving forward. "Good," I said. "After breakfast, we'll review the lawsuit paperwork together, then meet with the financial advisor at 11. Diane nodded, a new resolve visible in her posture. "I'm ready." As we ate in relative silence, I recognized that my greatest resistance wasn't to helping Diane. It was to letting go of the narrative I'd constructed about her, about us, about my place in this family. For years, I'd defined myself partly through the injury done to me in this house. What would it mean to release that definition and forge a new one based not on past wounds, but on present choices? I didn't yet have the answer, but as we cleared the breakfast dishes and prepared to tackle the day's challenges, I felt a slight shifting within, the first tentative movements toward a perspective I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. The financial advisor's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building on Main Street. Sunlight streamed through large windows, softening the otherwise clinical feel of the space. Jessica Chen, no relation to me, had been my college roommate, Layla's older sister. When I'd called her the previous evening explaining the situation, she'd immediately rearranged her schedule to accommodate us. "Emma, good to see you," Jessica greeted me with a warm handshake before turning to Diane. "And you must be Mrs. Reynolds. Thank you for bringing your documentation." Diane nodded stiffly, clutching the organized folder we'd prepared. Her nervousness was palpable, and I realized how hard this must be for her, exposing her financial failures to a stranger, with her former stepdaughter as witness. "Please call me Diane," she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jessica had us sit at a round conference table rather than across from her desk, a subtle way of establishing partnership rather than authority. "Before we dive, Into specifics, she began. I want to assure you that I've seen worse situations than yours recover, Diane. Financial crisis doesn't define your worth as a person, and it doesn't have to determine your future. Diane's shoulders relaxed slightly at these words. We spent the next hour methodically reviewing her financial situation, with Jessica asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes. Unlike our kitchen table session, this review felt clinical and objective, stripped of the emotional baggage that had colored our discussion at home. Based on what you've shared, Jessica said finally, we're looking at 3 distinct issues. First, the immediate lawsuit demanding payment in full. Second, the unsustainable overall debt burden. And third, the lack of stable income to address either problem. Diane nodded grimly. That about sums it up. Let's start with the lawsuit, Jessica continued. Typically, I'd recommend negotiating a settlement, but you've indicated they're unwilling to consider that option. Brian's parents were clear, Diane confirmed. They want full repayment plus their legal fees. Jessica's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight narrowing of her eyes. From a purely financial perspective, that's unusual. Most creditors prefer getting something rather than risking getting nothing through prolonged legal action. I think it's about more than the money, I suggested. From what Diane's told me, they feel deceived about the wedding financing arrangement. Ah, Jessica nodded. So there's an emotional component. That complicates things. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her legal pad. What's your relationship with your daughter and son-in-law like, Diane? Good, Diane answered quickly, then hesitated. At least I thought it was. Madison calls weekly. We've been discussing the baby's nursery design. And does she know about this lawsuit? Diane shook her head. I suggested Diane inform both her children about the situation, I added. She's planning to call them today. Jessica nodded approvingly. That's a good first step. Sometimes family can offer perspectives, or solutions, we haven't considered. She turned back to her notes. The broader debt picture is concerning, but not unsalvageable. You have multiple high-interest credit cards, a home equity line nearing its limit, and these medical bills and collections. She looked up at Diane. Did you know you might qualify for retroactive assistance with some of these medical expenses? Diane blinked in surprise. No, I didn't. Many hospitals have financial assistance programs that can be applied even after billing. Given your current income situation, you'd likely qualify. That could potentially eliminate about $12,000 of this debt. For the first time since I'd arrived back in town, I saw a flicker of genuine hope in Diane's eyes. Jessica continued methodically through potential strategies: debt consolidation, negotiated settlements with credit card companies, potential bankruptcy implications. Each option came with pros and cons, clearly explained without judgment. What? About the house? Diane asked finally, voicing the question that had hovered unspoken throughout the meeting. Jessica looked between us. Emma mentioned that ownership transfers to her soon. That's both a complication and potentially an asset in resolving this situation. She turned to me. Have you decided what you plan to do with the property? All eyes were on me now. The truth was, I still hadn't fully decided. The childhood fantasy of reclaiming my home had centered on personal vindication, not practical considerations of property management or Diane's living situation. I'm still weighing options, I answered carefully. Jessica nodded, accepting my non-answer. For now, let's develop a plan assuming the housing situation remains stable for at least the next 3 months. That gives us time to address the most pressing concerns. By the end of our 2-hour consultation, we had a preliminary action plan. Diane would apply for medical bill assistance, contact specific creditors with settlement offers Jessica would help draft, and most immediately, reach out to Madison and Marcus about the lawsuit situation. Financial recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. Jessica told Diane as we prepared to leave. But you've taken the hardest step today, facing the reality of your situation and asking for help. As we walked out of the building into the bright, autumn afternoon, Diane seemed simultaneously exhausted and lightened, as if the burden of secrecy had weighed as heavily as the debt itself. "Your friend is very good at what she does," she commented as we headed toward the cafe where we'd planned to have lunch. "She didn't make me feel judged." "That's why I suggested her," I replied. "Financial problems happen to good people, often, through a combination of circumstances and choices, not moral failings." Diane gave me a sidelong glance. "When did you get so wise?" The question wasn't sarcastic, but genuinely curious, and I found myself considering it seriously. Experience, I suppose, and learning from others who've faced similar challenges. We settled at a corner table in Riverside Cafe, a local institution I'd frequented in high school when I needed escape from the basement and quiet place to study. The same faded paintings of local landmarks adorned the walls, and the menu hadn't changed in a decade. After ordering, Diane pulled out her phone. "I should call Madison while I have the courage. Would you excuse me for a few minutes?" I nodded, watching as she stepped outside for privacy. Through the window, I could see her pacing nervously, then stopping abruptly as the call connected. Her free hand gesticulated as she spoke, then fell still. Even from a distance, I could see her posture change, shoulders slumping slightly, head bowing. When she returned to our table, her eyes were rimmed with red, but her voice was steady. Madison was shocked, then angry. She had no idea about the loan from Brian's parents. She's going to call them herself to try to negotiate some kind of settlement. "That's a positive step," I said. "What about the rest of your financial situation? Did you explain that as well?" "Yes." She couldn't believe I'd kept everything hidden for so long. Diane took a sip of water. "She asked about you too. Why you were involved in all this." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you came to assess the house situation before your birthday and discovered my financial disaster. That you've been—" She paused, searching for words. "More understanding than I had any right to expect." I nodded, uncomfortable with the characterization but choosing not to contest it. Our server arrived with our lunch, providing a welcome interruption. "I'll call Marcus after we eat," Diane continued once we were alone again. "Madison wants to talk to him first, prepare him a bit." We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Diane spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Emma, can I ask you something personal?" I looked up from my sandwich, wary but curious. "You can ask." "How did you become so—" She gestured vaguely with her fork. "Balanced. After everything you went through, losing your mother, then your father dealing with me in the basement years, you should be angry, bitter. But you're not. You're focused, considerate, successful." She set her fork down. "I've spent years blaming circumstances for my poor choices, while you've overcome far worse to build a good life." The question caught me off guard. I had never considered myself particularly balanced or exceptional in my resilience. I'd simply done what needed doing one step at a time. "I had good mentors," I said finally, thinking of specific people who had guided me through difficult periods. Not just Dad, though he gave me a solid foundation, but others along the way who appeared exactly when I needed their wisdom. "Like who?" Diane asked, genuine interest in her expression. "Mrs. Kellerman, my high school English teacher. She noticed when I was struggling and created a quiet space in her classroom where I could study during lunch periods." I smiled at the memory. She also recommended me for a summer internship at Hartwell Architects, which eventually led to my college major and career path. "I remember her," Diane said. "She always asked about you at parent-teacher conferences, seemed particularly invested." She was. And then there was Dr. Rivera, my academic advisor in college. When I was considering dropping out after sophomore year because money was tight, she helped me find additional scholarships and a campus job that worked with my class schedule. I took a sip of my iced tea, reflecting on these pivotal relationships. What they all had in common was seeing potential in me that I couldn't always see myself. They offered practical help, not just encouragement, and they never let me use difficult circumstances as an excuse for giving up. Diane was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "I should have been one of those mentors for you," she said finally. "Instead, I was an obstacle you had to overcome." The admission hung between us, neither accusation nor excuse but simple acknowledgement. I didn't deny it or offer false comfort. "Yes," I said simply, "but that's in the past. Right now, we need to focus on creating a sustainable future for both of us." Just then, a familiar figure approached our table, Mrs. Kellerman herself, as if conjured by our conversation. Now, in her 70s, she moved more slowly than I remembered, but her eyes remained sharp and perceptive behind stylish glasses. "Emma Reynolds," she exclaimed, genuine delight in her voice. What a wonderful surprise. I stood to embrace her, unexpected emotion tightening my throat. "Mrs. Kellerman, you look wonderful." "Retired life agrees with me," she laughed, then nodded politely to Diane. "Mrs. Reynolds, nice to see you as well." After brief catch-up pleasantries, Mrs. Kellerman asked, "Are you back in town for long, Emma?" "Just a week or so," I explained, "sorting out some family matters." Something in my tone must have conveyed more than my words, because Mrs. Kellerman gave me an assessing look. "Perhaps you'd have time for tea before you leave?" "I'd love to. Hear more about your work in Chicago." "I'd like that," I said sincerely. After she departed with another warm embrace, Diane commented, "She always did have a special fondness for you." "She saw a student who needed support and provided it," I replied. "That was her gift, seeing what others needed and responding with practical kindness." "A true mentor," Diane murmured. The word hung in the air between us, resonant with meaning. In that moment, I realized that what Diane needed now wasn't just financial advice or practical assistance, but mentorship, guidance through this crisis from someone who had successfully navigated their own difficult transitions. "Diane," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I can't erase the past or solve all your current problems, but I can help you develop the skills and perspective to address them effectively yourself. That's what my mentors did for me." She looked startled, then thoughtful. "You would do that? After everything?" "I'm not doing it for you exactly," I clarified. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and because resolving this situation properly benefits me too. The house transfer will go more smoothly if your financial situation stabilizes." It wasn't the most emotionally generous framing, but it was honest. We weren't family in any meaningful sense, despite our legal connection. But we were two adults with interconnected challenges, capable of working together toward mutually beneficial solutions. "I appreciate that clarity," Diane said, surprising me. "And I accept your offer of mentorship." She spoke the word carefully, as if testing its appropriateness to our situation. As we finished our lunch and prepared to return to the house, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turn our relationship had taken. The basement girl was now positioned to guide the very woman who had relegated her there years ago. Life's ironies never ceased to amaze me. Walking back, the autumn sun warm on our shoulders, Diane asked, "What's the first lesson from Mentor Emma?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about what had helped me most during my own difficult transitions. "Radical honesty," I said finally. "With yourself first, then with others. No more hiding bills, minimizing problems, or pretending everything's fine when it isn't. No more decisions based on appearances rather than realities." Diane nodded slowly. That's harder than it sounds. Most worthwhile things are, I replied. But it gets easier with practice, and it's the foundation for everything else. Without honesty, no financial plan or legal strategy will succeed long term. As we approached the house, my future property, her current home, I added, call Marcus when we get back. Complete the circle of disclosure. Then we'll outline specific steps for addressing the medical bills and preparing for Saturday's meeting with Brian's parents. Diane straightened her shoulders slightly, a new resolve visible in her posture. Radical honesty. I can start there. That afternoon, as Diane made her difficult call to Marcus in the backyard, I realized that in offering to mentor her through this crisis, I had inadvertently found a constructive channel for my own complex emotions about our shared past. The resentment that had smoldered for years could now be transformed into something productive. Wisdom passed forward, lessons learned through hardship now serving a purpose beyond my own success. Mrs. Kellerman would approve, I thought with a small smile. She had always maintained that our most painful experiences, properly processed, could become our greatest sources of insight and value to others. The basement girl had found her voice, not in recrimination or revenge, but in the clear, firm guidance that she herself had once needed and received from others. There was a symmetry to it that felt right, a closing of circles, a rebalancing, of accounts more profound than any financial ledger. Diane returned to our table just as the server delivered our lunch. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and she clutched her phone tightly, knuckles white against the black case. Without a word, she slid back into her seat and took a long sip of water. How did it go? I asked, though her expression told me enough. Madison was shocked, Diane replied, her voice steadier than I expected. Then angry, then worried about the baby and whether stress might affect the pregnancy. She set down her glass carefully. She's going to call Brian, then his parents. She wants to try to intervene. I nodded, processing this. And did you tell her about the overall financial situation? Yes. She had no idea how bad things had gotten. I've been so careful to maintain appearances. Diane picked up her fork but made no move to eat her salad. She asked why I never told her, why I let them have such an expensive wedding when I couldn't afford it. What did you say? The truth, that I wanted her to have everything perfect, that I didn't want her to worry about me. Diane finally took a small bite of salad, chewing mechanically. She said that wasn't my decision to make, that she would have been happy with something simpler if she'd known. The irony wasn't lost on me. Diane had spent years making unilateral decisions about what others needed, deciding the twins needed my bedroom more than I did, deciding Madison needed an elaborate wedding more than financial honesty. In both cases, her choices had backfired spectacularly. What about Marcus? I asked. I'll call him after lunch. Madison wants to speak with him first, to prepare him. She finally met my eyes. She also asked about you, why you were involved. This surprised me. What did you tell her? That you came to assess the house situation before your birthday and discovered the financial crisis. That you've been... She hesitated, searching for the right words. More generous than I had any right to expect. Something in her tone made me uncomfortable. A hint of martyrdom that felt too familiar. This isn't about generosity, Diane. It's about finding practical solutions to real problems. She nodded quickly. Of course. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the cafe's ambient noise filling the space between us. Around us, life continued its normal rhythm. A young mother trying to convince her toddler to eat vegetables, an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie, teenagers huddled over textbooks in the corner booth. I've been thinking about the house, I said finally. Diane's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Oh? I don't want to live there. She blinked, clearly surprised by my directness. You don't? I shook my head. I have a life in Chicago, a job I love, friends, a relationship that's becoming serious. Moving back here has never been part of my plan. I assumed you would. Sell it, Diane said carefully. That's one option. I took a sip of my iced tea, organizing my thoughts. But there might be alternatives that could address multiple aspects of this situation simultaneously. Diane set down her fork entirely now, giving me her full attention. What do you mean? The house has equity. Not as much as you might have hoped, given the market downturn and some deferred maintenance, but still substantial. If I were to sell it, that equity could potentially help resolve some of your debt issues. Hope flickered across her face. You would consider that? I'm considering several options, I clarified. But before I make any decisions, I need something from you. What's that? A concrete plan, not just for addressing the immediate financial crisis, but for ensuring you don't end up in this situation again. Jessica's guidance is a start. But this goes beyond financial strategies. Diane nodded slowly. That's reasonable. I also need to speak with Madison and Marcus directly. Not to place blame or create more family drama, but because any solution will affect all of us in different ways. This request visibly unsettled her. They're adults with their own lives. You don't need their permission to make decisions about your property. This isn't about permission, I explained patiently. It's about information and perspective. The choices made now will have long-term implications for everyone involved. She seemed to struggle with this concept, and I realized how accustomed she was to compartmentalizing, keeping the twins separate from her financial reality, keeping me separate from family decisions, keeping problems hidden until they became catastrophes. I'll help you through this process, I continued, but only with complete transparency among all parties involved. No more secrets, no more unilateral decisions made for everyone's good without their input. Diane was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing the condensation on her water glass. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the defensive edge that had characterized so many of our interactions. You remind me of your father, she said softly. He always insisted on addressing problems directly, even when it was uncomfortable. Used to admire that about him before it became inconvenient to my preferred way of handling things. The comparison to my father warmed something in me, even as I registered the subtle self-awareness in her statement. Is that a yes to my conditions? She nodded. Yes. Complete transparency. Family meetings if necessary. Whatever it takes to find a workable solution. Good. Then let's develop a concrete action plan for the next few days. Over dessert, a shared piece of apple pie that had been my father's favorite, we outlined next steps. Diane would call Marcus after lunch, then begin gathering documentation for the medical bill assistance applications. I would research current market values for the house and consult with a real estate attorney about options that might leverage the property's equity while addressing the immediate lawsuit threat. What made you decide to help me? Diane asked, as we waited for the check. You could have simply waited until your birthday, taken possession of the house, and let me face the consequences of my choices. It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly since discovering the extent of her financial distress. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. Part of it is pragmatic. Evicting you would be legally and emotionally complicated. Part is respect for what my father would have wanted. I paused, considering. And part of it is realizing that holding on to resentment has its own cost. You have every right to resent me, she said quietly. The basement, the preferential treatment, of the twins, all of it. Having the right to feel something doesn't mean it's beneficial to keep feeling it, I replied. I spent years defining myself through the injury done to me in that house. It became part of my identity, the basement girl who overcame adversity, who proved everyone wrong through sheer determination. Diane winced visibly at the characterization. Emma, Let me finish, I said gently. That narrative served a purpose. It fueled my drive to succeed, to become financially and emotionally independent. But at some point, continuing to center my story around past hurts became limiting rather than motivating. The server arrived with our check, temporarily halting the conversation. As Diane reached for her wallet, I waved her off and placed my credit card on the tray. My treat, I said, forestalling her protest. Consider it a small step in our new collaborative approach. Once the server departed, Diane leaned forward. For what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much, I am genuinely sorry for how I treated you. Not just because I need your help now, but because I've had years to reflect on my failures as a stepmother. The apology hung between us, neither accepted nor rejected. I wasn't ready to absolve her completely, but I acknowledged the sincerity in her words with a nod. Moving forward is more important than looking back right now, I said finally. We have practical problems to solve. As we walked back to the house, the afternoon sun warm against our backs, I felt a shift in our dynamic. Not friendship, certainly, but perhaps the beginning of a working partnership born of necessity and mutual interest. At home, Diane immediately went to make her call to Marcus, disappearing into the backyard for privacy. I settled at the dining room table with my laptop, researching local real estate trends and property values. The market had cooled considerably since my last casual check a year ago. Homes in our neighborhood were selling for about 15% less than their peak values, and many were sitting unsold for months. Our house, my house soon, would likely fetch less than I had optimistically imagined during my years of anticipation. Still, even in the current market, the property had significant value. The question was how best to leverage that value to address both Diane's immediate crisis and my own long-term interests. I was deep in research when Diane returned from her call with Marcus. Unlike after her conversation with Madison, she appeared more composed, even slightly relieved. How did it go? I asked, looking up from my screen. Better than expected, she replied, sinking into the chair across from me. Marcus was shocked but practical. He's already researching bankruptcy laws and looking into whether his company's legal department might offer some guidance. That's helpful, I noted. Did he have any immediate suggestions? He thinks I should try negotiating directly with Brian's parents one more time, with Madison and Brian present. He believes they might be more receptive to a structured payment. Plan if their son advocates for it? I nodded thoughtfully. That's worth attempting. When could that meeting happen? Madison's checking their availability, possibly this weekend. Diane hesitated. Marcus also asked if you would consider being there. This surprised me. Me? Why? He thinks having all stakeholders present would demonstrate seriousness and unity in addressing the problem. And she paused. He specifically mentioned wanting to apologize to you in person. Apologize? For what? Diane looked uncomfortable. For his behavior when you were teenagers. He said he was old enough to know better than to treat you the way he did. This was unexpected. In my recollections of those difficult years, Marcus had been a secondary character, occasionally mocking or dismissive, but not the primary source of my unhappiness. That role had belonged squarely to Diane, with Madison playing supporting actress in the drama of my exclusion. I'll think about it, I said noncommittally, turning back to my research. Later that evening, as we prepared a simple dinner together, a tentative new routine emerging in our shared tasks, Diane broached the subject that had been hanging unspoken between us all day. If you don't plan to live in the house, and selling might be complicated in the current market, what are you considering doing with it? I measured pasta into the boiling water before answering. I'm exploring several options. Renting it out is one possibility. It would provide income while preserving the asset until the market improves. Selling on contract is another, though. Finding a qualified buyer might be challenging. And where would I go? She asked quietly, attention fixed on the onion she was chopping. The question was direct, yet vulnerable. Diane acknowledging explicitly that her future living situation depended on my decisions. That depends on which option proves most viable, I replied. And on the specific plan we develop for addressing your financial situation. Everything is interconnected. She nodded, accepting this non-answer with the same grace she'd shown earlier. I appreciate your willingness to consider options beyond immediate eviction. I never said I was planning to evict you, I pointed out, stirring the pasta. That assumption came from you. Can you blame me? If our situations were reversed, after how I treated you. I turned to face her fully. Let's be clear about something, Diane. I'm not making decisions based on revenge or on what you deserve. I'm looking for practical solutions that address real problems. Emotion is a luxury we can't afford right now. She nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. You're right. And Emma? I'm committed to whatever plan we develop, not just to solving the immediate crisis, but to ensuring I never create another one like it. As we sat down to our simple meal of pasta and salad, I realized that Diane's words represented something significant. A commitment not just to addressing her financial problems, but to changing the patterns that had created them. Whether that commitment would translate into sustainable action remained to be seen, but it was a start. After dinner, I called Zach to update him on the situation and my extended stay. His response was supportive, but tinged with concern. Are you sure you want to get this involved in her problems? He asked. From everything you've told me about your history with her, it's complicated, I admitted, but I need to see this through, at least to the point of having a clear plan. I can't just walk away knowing what's at stake. That's one of the things I love about you, he said softly. Your sense of responsibility, even to people who may not deserve it. Love. The word hung between us, new and significant. We hadn't yet exchanged those words formally, though our relationship had been trending steadily in that direction. Thank you for understanding, I replied, sidestepping the emotional territory for now. I should have a clearer timeline by the weekend. After we hung up, I sat on my basement bed, taking stock of the day's developments. In the span of hours, we had moved from acknowledging problems to developing concrete strategies for addressing them. Diane had taken the difficult step of revealing her financial reality to her children. Madison and Marcus were engaged in finding solutions rather than placing blame. It wasn't resolution, but it was meaningful progress, the first steps on what would likely be a long and complicated journey. As I prepared for bed, I realized I had made a significant internal shift as well. I was no longer simply reacting to Diane's crisis. I was actively committing to finding a path forward that honored my father's legacy while protecting my own interests. The basement that had once symbolized my powerlessness now represented something different. A temporary way station on the road to resolution. A place from which I could direct the unfolding process with clarity and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, conversations with real estate professionals, research into debt resolution strategies, preparation for the potential meeting with Brian's parents. But for the first time since arriving, I felt equipped to face those challenges with a clear vision and committed purpose. The next morning brought unexpected momentum. I woke to find Diane already at the dining room table, surrounded by neatly organized paperwork and her laptop open to a spreadsheet I didn't recognize. "Good morning," she said when she noticed me. "I hope I didn't wake you. I've been up since 5. "What are you working on?" I asked, pouring myself coffee from the freshly brewed pot. I couldn't sleep, so I started implementing Jessica's suggestions. She gestured to the organized stacks before her. "I've completed the financial assistance applications for the hospital bills and drafted settlement offer letters for the 3 largest credit card companies." I was impressed by her initiative. That's excellent progress. What about the spreadsheet? A comprehensive budget, she replied, turning the laptop so I could see. Based on different scenarios, finding part-time work, securing a full-time position, various housing situations. She hesitated. I wanted to show you I'm serious about long-term changes, not just crisis management. The spreadsheet was meticulous, with multiple tabs representing different financial scenarios. Each included detailed income projections, expense limitations, and debt repayment schedules. It was the work of someone who had spent hours confronting hard realities rather than avoiding them. This is thorough, I acknowledged, scrolling through the various scenarios. Have you identified which options seem most viable? Diane nodded. Based on my qualifications and the local job market, returning to the school district seems unlikely. But I've found several possibilities in administrative support roles that would utilize my organizational skills. She pointed to a specific tab. This scenario assumes a full-time position at around $38,000 annually, which is realistic based on current openings. I continued examining her work, noting the conservative spending projections and aggressive debt repayment schedules. You've allocated very little for discretionary expenses. That's intentional, she said firmly. I've lived beyond my means for too long. It's time for radical honesty about needs versus wants. As I studied the numbers, I realized Diane had done more than just create financial projections. She'd constructed a framework for a fundamentally different approach to her life. The woman who had spent thousands on her daughter's wedding while relegating her stepdaughter to a basement was acknowledging, through these careful calculations, the consequences of prioritizing appearances over authenticity. I received texts from both Madison and Marcus this morning, she continued. Madison spoke with Brian, who's agreed to talk with his parents. They're coming here Saturday afternoon. That's good news, I replied, mentally adjusting my own schedule. It gives us time to prepare a comprehensive proposal. There's something else, Diane said, her expression turning more serious. Madison asked me directly about your living situation after your father died. She had always assumed you chose the basement for privacy. When I told her the truth, that I had essentially relegated you there to give the twins your room, she was horrified. I set down my coffee cup, surprised by this revelation. She didn't know? Diane shook her head. I presented it to the twins as a practical rearrangement. Madison was 14, old enough to question it, perhaps, but also young enough to accept what I told her. She looked down at her hands. It appears I've failed everyone in different ways. Her admission hung in the air between us, neither accusation nor excuse, but simple acknowledgement of harm done. Before I could respond, my phone rang, Jessica Chen calling for our scheduled follow-up. I spent the next hour in the backyard, discussing options with Jessica while watching squirrels chase each other around the old oak tree. The financial picture remained challenging, but not hopeless. Jessica had several creative suggestions for addressing the lawsuit specifically, including potential equity options that wouldn't require immediate cash outlays. When I returned inside, Diane was on the phone herself, her expression brightening as she spoke. After ending the call, she looked up with the first genuine smile I'd seen since arriving. That was Greenfield Academy, she announced. They have an immediate opening for an administrative coordinator in their admissions office. The director remembered me from when Marcus applied there. I volunteered for their fundraising auction that year. She's invited me for an interview tomorrow morning. That's fantastic, I said, genuinely pleased for her. Greenfield was a prestigious private school on the outskirts of town, known for treating its employees well. The salary is higher than anything in my projections, she continued, excitement evident in her voice. And it includes benefits, health insurance, retirement contribution, even tuition remission if I ever wanted to pursue additional education. For the first time, I could see tangible hope in Diane's countenance. Not just relief at potential, rescue from financial catastrophe, but genuine enthusiasm about rebuilding her life on stronger foundations. "I should prepare for the interview," she said, already standing to gather her papers. "Update my resume, research recent developments at the school." "Use Dad's study," I suggested impulsively. "The lighting is better, and the desk has more space." She paused, clearly surprised by the offer. "Are you sure? I know that room is special to you." "It's a practical suggestion," I replied, trying to downplay the significance. "No sense hunching over the dining room table when there's a proper workspace available." Diane gathered her materials with careful movements, as if handling precious artifacts. "Thank you, Emma. This means a lot." After she disappeared upstairs, I turned my attention to the house itself. While Diane focused on employment possibilities, I needed to assess the property that would soon officially be mine. With professional detachment, I walked through each room, making notes about condition, potential improvements, and market considerations. The house had good bones, solid construction from an era when craftsmanship mattered, generous room sizes, hardwood floors throughout. But years of deferred maintenance were evident. The kitchen desperately needed updating, several windows showed signs of seal failure, and the roof would require replacement within the next few years. In the current market, these issues would significantly impact both sale price and time to sell. Even with improvements, the property would likely fetch less than I had imagined during my years of anticipation. This reality necessitated adjustments to my own long-term financial planning. By early afternoon, I had compiled comprehensive notes and begun researching local real estate agents with strong sale records in our neighborhood. Diane emerged from Dad's study looking focused and prepared, her interview materials organized. In a professional portfolio I recognized from her teaching assistant days. "I think I'm ready," she announced, setting the portfolio aside. "Now I just need to figure out what to wear that looks professional but not desperate." "Let me help," I offered, surprising myself. I have a good eye for interview attire. Together we assessed her closet options, settling on a well-cut navy dress with a structured cardigan and simple pearl earrings that had been a gift from my father on their first anniversary. The ensemble struck the right balance, professional without seeming overdone, classic rather than trendy. "You know," Diane said as she hung the outfit on her closet door, "this is the first normal conversation we've had in maybe ever." The observation gave me pause. She was right. Our interactions had always been strained, defined by the power imbalance of our stepmother-stepdaughter relationship, and later by my determined distance. This simple act of helping her prepare for an interview felt remarkably ordinary, almost familial. "I'm not very good at normal," I admitted. "At least not with you." She nodded, acknowledging the complexity without defensiveness. "I never gave you much reason to be." Before the conversation could turn heavier, my phone chimed with an email notification. "It's from the real estate attorney I contacted," I explained, scanning the message. "She can meet with us tomorrow afternoon to discuss options for the property." "That's good timing," Diane noted. "After my interview, perhaps?" "Yes, let's plan on that. And speaking of planning," I added, "we should prepare for Saturday's meeting with Brian's parents. We'll need a clear proposal regarding the wedding debt." Diane's expression tightened at the mention of the lawsuit. "Every time I think about facing them, I feel physically ill. The shame of it." "Shame isn't productive," I said, more sharply than intended. Then, softening my tone, "You made mistakes. Now you're correcting them. Focus on solutions, not feelings." She looked startled by my directness but nodded slowly. "You're right. Solutions, not feelings." Throughout the remainder of the day, we worked separately but with common purpose. Diane, finalizing her interview preparations while I developed property scenarios to discuss with the attorney. Occasionally, one of us would consult the other, a collaborative rhythm emerging naturally from our shared objectives. By evening, we had each made significant progress. Diane had completed a sophisticated presentation highlighting her organizational and communication skills, designed to showcase her qualifications for the greenfield position. I had compiled a comprehensive property analysis, including current market valuation, improvement costs, and potential rental income projections. "I've been thinking," Diane said as we prepared a simple dinner together. "If I get this position, at Greenfield, it would significantly change my financial outlook. The starting salary is nearly twice what I was making as a teaching assistant." I nodded, dicing vegetables for the stir-fry we'd decided on. "That would certainly improve your debt repayment capacity. It would also change what might be possible regarding housing," she continued carefully. "The campus is on the other side of town from here. Living closer would make more sense, especially during winter months." This was the first time Diane had voluntarily broached the possibility of moving from the house without my prompting or pressure. I recognized it as significant progress, evidence she was thinking practically about her future rather than clinging to an unsustainable past. "That's worth considering," I acknowledged. "We can add it to the scenarios for tomorrow's meeting with the attorney." After dinner, we retreated to our separate spaces, Diane to make final preparations for her interview, me to call Zach with updates on the situation. As I settled onto my basement bed with my phone, I realized how much had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, the challenges had seemed overwhelming, the path forward obscured by decades of emotional history and financial mismanagement. Today, concrete progress illuminated potential solutions: Diane's job prospect, the upcoming legal consultation, the scheduled meeting with Brian's parents. Nothing was resolved yet, but the shift from paralysis to movement created its own momentum. Zach answered on the second ring, his voice warming when he realized it was me. "Hey, there's my favorite architect. How's the stepmother situation?" I found myself sharing the day's developments with unexpected enthusiasm, detailing Diane's initiative with the budget spreadsheet, her interview opportunity, and our collaborative approach to addressing the various challenges. "Wow," Zach said, when I finished. "That's actually impressive progress. She sounds genuinely committed to turning things around." "It appears so," I agreed, though sustaining commitment through difficult implementation is the real test. "True, but recognizing the need for change is an essential first step." He paused. "You sound different, Emma. Less angry." His observation caught me off guard. "Do I?" "Definitely. Yesterday you seemed tense and conflicted. Today you're focused and, I don't know, more resolved? Like you've made some inner peace with the situation." I considered his words, realizing their accuracy. The anger that had been my constant companion whenever I thought about Diane and the basement years had receded, not entirely gone, but no longer dominating my emotional landscape. "I think you're right," I admitted. "Working alongside her, seeing her actively address her problems instead of avoiding them, it's changed my perspective somewhat." "That's healthy," Zach said warmly. "Carrying that resentment around was never good for you, even if it was justified." After ending the call, I sat contemplating Zach's observation. The anger I'd nurtured for years had served a purpose, fueling my determination to succeed independently. But it had also limited me in ways I was only beginning to recognize. Keeping me tethered to past hurts, defining my identity through opposition rather than affirmation. For the first time, I could envision resolving the house situation without it being primarily about vindicating my teenage self. The practical challenges before us, Diane's debt, the property decision, my own career path, deserved consideration on their current merits, not as proxies for settling old scores. As I prepared for bed, I heard Diane moving around upstairs, probably setting out her interview outfit for morning. The sound no longer triggered the automatic tension it once had. Progress, indeed. Morning light streamed through Diane's bedroom window as she stood before the mirror, adjusting her navy dress with trembling fingers. I watched from the doorway, having come upstairs to wish her luck before her interview. "You look professional," I assured her, confident without trying too hard. She turned to face me, anxiety evident in her pinched expression. "I haven't interviewed for a position in over 15 years. What if they ask about the gap in my employment? What if they want references from the school district that let me go?" "Be honest but strategic," I advised. "Focus on your organizational skills and experience managing complex schedules and communications as a teaching assistant. As for references, offer the names of teachers you worked closely with rather than administrators." Diane nodded, taking a deep breath. "You're right. I can do this." She gathered her portfolio and car keys. "The meeting with the attorney is at 2, correct?" "Yes, I'll text you the address." After Diane left for her interview, I spent the morning on a video call with my own office in Chicago, updating my team on a project I'd been managing remotely. My boss had been surprisingly understanding about my extended absence, perhaps because I'd accumulated weeks of unused vacation time over the years. "Take the time you need to sort out your family situation," he'd said. "The Peterson project is in good hands with Alicia stepping in." Family situation. The phrase lingered in my mind after the call ended. For years, I'd insisted to colleagues and friends that I had no real family, just a distant stepmother and step-siblings I barely knew. Yet here I was, deeply entangled in Diane's financial crisis, navigating complex emotions about a shared past, making decisions that would affect all our futures. At noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Interview went well. They're checking references and want me to come back tomorrow to meet the head of school." "That's excellent news," I replied. "We'll celebrate when you get home." Her response came quickly. "Home. It's strange to hear you call it that again." I stared at her words, unsure how to respond. Was this still my home? It had been my childhood house, certainly, but home was a more complicated concept. My apartment in Chicago felt more like home now, a space I had chosen and created for myself, filled with objects and memories that reflected my adult life. Before I could formulate a reply, another text arrived. "Sorry, didn't mean to make things awkward. See you at the attorney's office." The law office of Patricia Winters occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian on Maple Street. Large windows offered views of the town square, and tasteful art-adorned walls painted a soft gray. Patricia herself was a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked black hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "So," she said after introductions and preliminary pleasantries, "you have an interesting situation here. Emma, you're about to inherit a property that has significant equity, but also comes with complications in the form of your stepmother's current residence and financial distress." Diane flinched slightly at this blunt assessment, but remained composed. "That's correct," I confirmed. "We're exploring options that might address both the property transition and Diane's debt crisis, particularly the pending lawsuit." Patricia nodded, making notes on a legal pad. "Before we discuss specific strategies, let me confirm some facts. The property transfers to Emma's sole ownership on her 25th birthday, approximately 7 weeks from now. There are no liens against the property itself, correct?" "Correct," Diane said. "The mortgage was paid off with Richard's life insurance. There is a home equity line of credit with a current balance of approximately $42,000. And the lawsuit from your daughter's in-laws is for $47,000 plus legal fees, with no current willingness to negotiate a payment plan." Patricia reviewed the documents we'd provided. "Given these circumstances, you have several options." For the next hour, Patricia outlined various approaches, from selling the house and dividing proceeds in a way that would address Diane's debts, to refinancing to access equity, to creating a formal rental agreement that would provide Diane housing while generating income for me. Each option has advantages and drawbacks, Patricia explained. Selling provides immediate liquidity, but may result in less than optimal returns in the current market. Refinancing preserves the asset, but creates a new debt obligation. A rental arrangement maintains status quo physically while formalizing the financial relationship. As we discussed the particulars of each scenario, a new complication emerged, one neither Diane nor I had fully considered. There's also the matter of capital gains taxes if you sell, Patricia noted, looking at me. Since this will be an inherited property rather than your primary residence, you wouldn't qualify for the exclusion that applies to a personal home. What does that mean financially? I asked, mentally recalculating. It means approximately 20% of any profit from the sale would go to taxes, Patricia explained. Given the property's likely appreciation since your father purchased it, that could be a significant amount. This new information altered the financial calculations considerably. Selling the house, the option I had assumed would be simplest, suddenly carried substantial tax implications that would reduce the net proceeds available for both Diane's debt resolution and my own future plans. Is there any way to minimize that tax impact? I asked. Patricia hesitated. There are strategies, but they involve longer time horizons than your immediate situation suggests. For instance, if you lived in the property as your primary residence for at least 2 years before selling, you could qualify for the capital gains exclusion. 2 years. The prospect of moving back to my hometown, living in the house that held so many complicated memories, seemed impossible given my established life in Chicago. What about a partial ownership transfer? Diane suggested unexpectedly. If Emma transferred, say, 20% ownership to me now, could we structure a later sale differently? Patricia's expression turned cautious. That's entering complex C territory with potential gift tax implications. It could also be perceived as an attempt to circumvent creditors if done after knowledge of the lawsuit. I wasn't suggesting anything improper, Diane said quickly, just exploring options. Of course, Patricia assured her. My job is to identify potential legal issues with various approaches. She turned to me. What's your primary objective here, Emma? Maximum financial return? Quick resolution? Helping your stepmother while protecting your interests? The question cut to the heart of the matter. What did I truly want from this situation? I want a solution that honors my father's intentions, while allowing me to move forward with my own life, I said slowly. And yes, helping Diane stabilize her situation is part of that, provided it involves sustainable changes rather than temporary fixes. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. In that case, let me suggest a different approach than what we've discussed so far. What if we structured a lease-to-own arrangement? How would that work? Diane asked, leaning forward with interest. Emma would become the legal owner as planned on her birthday. You would enter into a formal agreement where you lease the property with a portion of each payment credited toward an eventual purchase. This gives Emma immediate income from the property while providing you stable housing and a path to potential ownership. But how would that help with the immediate debt crisis? I questioned. Particularly the lawsuit demanding immediate payment? That's where creative financing comes in, Patricia explained. Emma could take out a home equity line against the property, which would have favorable terms given the substantial equity, and loan you the funds to settle the lawsuit. Your lease payments would then include repayment of that loan at a reasonable interest rate. I considered this option. It would address the immediate lawsuit crisis while creating a formal structure for Diane's continued residence. It would provide me income without requiring immediate sale of the property in a down market. Most importantly, it would establish clear financial boundaries while allowing Diane a path to potential home ownership if her employment situation stabilized. This would require absolute financial discipline on my part, Diane acknowledged, her expression serious. No more discretionary spending, strict adherence to the payment schedule. Yes, Patricia agreed, and I would recommend building in safeguards, specifically, clear consequences for any payment defaults. As we delved into the specifics of this arrangement, another complication emerged, one even more personal than tax implications. Given the family relationship, Patricia noted, emotional factors could complicate this business arrangement. I've seen similar agreements fall apart not because of financial issues, but because boundaries blur between family roles and business responsibilities. Her observation struck home. Could Diane and I truly maintain a landlord-tenant relationship after our complex history? Would I be able to enforce consequences if she faltered on payments? Would she resent making payments to her former stepdaughter for the house she had once shared with my father? We should discuss this privately before making any decisions, I suggested to Diane, who nodded in agreement. Patricia provided us with detailed outlines of each option we'd discussed, including approximate costs, timelines, and legal requirements. Take a few days to consider these alternatives, she advised. And remember that custom arrangements can be created to address your specific situation. Legal documents exist to serve human needs, not the other way around. As we left the attorney's office, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square. Neither of us spoke immediately, each processing the complex information we'd received. Coffee? I finally suggested, nodding toward Riverside Cafe across the street. Once settled at a corner table with steaming mugs before us, Diane broke the silence. The lease-to-own option seems most promising, but I'm concerned about your willingness to extend more credit given my history of financial mismanagement. I appreciated her directness. It would depend on several factors: your securing stable employment, a formal agreement with clear terms, and complete transparency about your ongoing financial situation. She nodded, wrapping her hands around her mug. The Greenfield position would make it viable. The salary is substantially better than my previous job, and the benefits would reduce my healthcare costs significantly. There's also the matter of Madison and Marcus, I noted. How would they feel about you making payments to me for the family home? Diane sighed, setting down her coffee. That's a fair question. Marcus would probably understand the practical aspects. Madison. She hesitated. Madison might have more complicated feelings, especially given what she now knows about the basement situation. The elephant in the room, my years in the basement while her children enjoyed upstairs bedrooms, had finally been directly acknowledged. I felt a strange lightness at its mention, as if bringing it into the open diminished its power. We should discuss that with them on Saturday, I suggested. Complete transparency means addressing the emotional aspects of this arrangement, not just the financial ones. Diane nodded slowly. You're right. No more compartmentalizing. No more pretending difficult realities don't exist. She met my eyes directly. Emma, I want you to know something. Regardless of what arrangement we make about the house, I am genuinely sorry for how I treated you. Not because I need your help now, but because what I did was wrong. The apology hung between us, unexpected in its timing and sincerity. I didn't immediately respond, taking a sip of coffee as I considered my words. I believe you, I said finally, and I appreciate the acknowledgement. But rebuilding trust requires more than apologies. It needs consistent action over time. I understand that, she replied. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness or for you to forget the past, just for the opportunity to demonstrate through actions that I've changed. As we walked back to the house, her current home, my future property, I reflected on how quickly surface progress could reveal deeper challenges. What had seemed like straightforward decisions about a house and some debts had expanded to encompass tax implications, legal complexities, family dynamics, and the possibility of a fundamentally altered relationship between Diane and me. These Deeper challenges demanded more than spreadsheets and legal consultations. They required honest communication, emotional intelligence, and the willingness to navigate uncomfortable territory without retreating to established patterns. That evening, as Diane prepared for her second interview at Greenfield and I reviewed Patricia's detailed outlines, a text arrived from Madison. "We'll be there Saturday at 10 a.m. Brian's parents have agreed to meet. Marcus is flying in tomorrow night." The upcoming meeting would test our newfound communication skills and collaborative approach. Convincing Brian's parents to accept a structured payment plan rather than immediate full repayment would require both persuasive arguments and authentic accountability from Diane. As I replied to confirm the meeting time, I realized we faced a critical juncture. The early progress we'd made, Diane's job prospect, our productive meeting with the attorney, the scheduled discussion with Brian's parents, had revealed more complex challenges beneath the surface. How we navigated these deeper waters would determine whether our initial momentum could be sustained or would falter against more substantial obstacles. That night, in my basement bedroom, I found myself not resentful of the space, but oddly appreciative of its familiarity. It provided a quiet place to process the day's revelations and prepare for the challenges ahead. Tomorrow would bring Diane's second interview, Marcus's arrival, and further planning for Saturday's crucial meeting. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time, I felt equipped to navigate it with clarity and purpose rather than reactive emotion. The basement girl was growing into something more complex, a woman capable of addressing difficult situations with both compassion and clear boundaries, of honoring the past without being imprisoned by it. Saturday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation that permeated the house. I woke early, the pale dawn light barely filtering through the basement windows, and spent a few quiet moments mentally preparing for the day ahead. The meeting with Brian's parents loomed large, our first real test of whether Diane's financial crisis could be navigated with dignity and practical solutions. Upstairs, I could already hear Diane moving about in the kitchen. When I emerged from the basement, I found her arranging fresh pastries on a serving plate, the coffee maker bubbling cheerfully on the counter. "You're up early," I observed, pouring myself a cup from the freshly brewed pot. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I've been rehearsing what to say to the Hargroves when they arrive." The sound of the shower running upstairs reminded me that Marcus had arrived late the previous evening. Our initial reunion had been brief, but surprisingly cordial, a quick exchange of greetings before he headed to bed, exhausted from his delayed flight. Today would bring our first real conversation in years. "Have you thought about how to structure the meeting?" I asked, selecting a blueberry scone from the plate. "Who should speak first? What documentation to have ready?" Diane looked momentarily overwhelmed. I assumed I would simply explain the situation and propose a payment plan based on my potential new income. I shook my head. "We need a more strategic approach. The Hargroves feel deceived. Addressing their emotional concerns is as important as presenting financial solutions." Before Diane could respond, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. At 23, he had grown into a lean, serious-looking young man with our father's height and Diane's expressive eyes. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, his damp hair carefully combed. "Morning," he said, nodding to both of us before heading directly to the coffee. Madison texted, "She and Brian will be here in about 30 minutes. His parents are driving separately and should arrive around 10. I studied him as he fixed his coffee. 3 sugars, just as he had taken it as a teenager. Despite everything, there was something comforting about these small constants, tiny threads of continuity in our fractured family tapestry. "Marcus," I said, deciding to address the elephant in the room directly, "I appreciate you flying in to help with this situation." He turned to face me, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, family crisis and all that." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "Besides, I owe you a conversation that's been years overdue. Diane glanced between us, clearly uncertain whether to stay or give us privacy. I should finish setting up the dining room for the meeting, she said, gathering the pastry plate and retreating quickly. Alone with my stepbrother for the first time in years, I found myself unexpectedly tongue-tied. What exactly did one say to a person who had shared your childhood home but never truly been family? Marcus broke the silence first. Madison told me about the basement situation. He set his coffee mug down deliberately. I want you to know that I didn't understand what was happening at the time. Mom presented it as a practical rearrangement that everyone had agreed to. You were 14, I replied, surprised by his initiative in raising the topic. It wasn't your responsibility to question your mother's decisions. Maybe not then, but later? He shook his head. By high school, I should have realized something was wrong. The way you avoided coming home, how you never invited friends over, the separate lives we all led under one roof. He met my eyes. Directly. I was old enough to see the unfairness, but I accepted the benefits without question. I'm sorry for that, Emma. His apology caught me off guard. I had spent years constructing a narrative in which Diane was the villain and the twins were merely secondary characters, beneficiaries of her favoritism, but not active participants in my exclusion. Marcus's acknowledgement of his passive complicity complicated that neat storyline. Thank you for saying that, I said finally. It means more than I expected it would. A car door slammed outside, interrupting our conversation. That'll be Madison, Marcus said, glancing toward the front of the house. We should probably talk more later, if you're willing. I nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. There was something cleansing about this direct acknowledgement of past wrongs, something that created space for a different kind of relationship moving forward. Madison's arrival brought a flurry of activity. At 8 months pregnant, she moved. With deliberate care, one hand supporting her lower back as she navigated the front steps. Brian hovered protectively beside her, a tall, serious young man with earnest eyes and a nervous smile. The introductions were somewhat awkward. None of us quite sure how formal or familiar to be after years of minimal contact. You look well, Emma, Madison offered, settling carefully onto the living room sofa. Chicago must agree with you. It does, I confirmed. And congratulations on the baby. When are you due? December 12th, she replied, her hand resting instinctively on her rounded belly. A boy. We're naming him James after Grandpa. The mention of my father created a moment of shared connection, a reminder of the one person who had truly bound us together as family. Before the conversation could continue, however, the doorbell rang again. The Hargroves had arrived. Robert and Patricia Hargrove were exactly as I had imagined them, impeccably dressed, reserved in manner, with the careful politeness of people who value propriety above all else. Brian clearly took after his father in appearance, though his mother's anxious energy was evident in his constant small movements. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Diane said as we all settled around the dining room table, which had been set with coffee, water, and the pastries she had arranged earlier. The formal setting lent a certain gravity to the proceedings, emphasizing that this was a business meeting despite the family connections. We're here because our son asked us to reconsider our position, Robert Hargrove stated flatly. But I want to be clear that we feel significantly misled about the financial arrangements for the wedding. Diane nodded, accepting this opening. Salvo with surprising composure. I understand, and you're right to feel that way. I wasn't honest about my financial situation, and I made promises I couldn't keep. There's no excuse for that deception. Her direct acknowledgement seemed to catch the Hargroves off guard. They had clearly come prepared for denials or excuses. Mom, Madison interjected, you should have told us. We would have planned a smaller wedding if we'd known the truth. I know that now, Diane replied. At the time, I convinced myself I was protecting you from worry, giving you the celebration you deserved. But the truth is, I was also protecting my own pride, maintaining appearances I couldn't afford. I watched this exchange with growing respect for Diane's newfound candor. The radical honesty we had discussed was clearly difficult for her, but she was embracing it with remarkable courage. Honesty now doesn't change the fact that you owe us $47,000, Patricia Hargrove noted, her voice cool, but not unkind. We extended that loan in good faith, with a clear repayment schedule you failed to meet. You're absolutely right, Diane agreed. I do owe you that money, and I have no intention of evading that responsibility. What I'm asking for today is not forgiveness of the debt, but a restructured payment plan that I can realistically fulfill. As Diane began outlining her new employment prospect and the budget she had created, I watched the Hargroves' expressions carefully. Robert remained skeptical, his arms crossed defensively, but Patricia showed hints of softening, small nods, thoughtful consideration of the figures Diane presented. This all sounds very organized, Patricia commented when Diane finished, but plans on paper don't necessarily translate to consistent payments. What's different now that would make this arrangement successful when the original one failed? This was the critical question, one that required more than financial projections to answer convincingly. Diane looked momentarily overwhelmed, and I decided to step in. If I may, I said, drawing all eyes to me. I'm Emma Reynolds, Richard's daughter from his first marriage. In a few weeks, I'll officially inherit the house per my father's will. I paused, ensuring I had everyone's attention. I'm proposing a structured arrangement that would provide additional security for your loan. The Hargroves straightened, clearly interested in this new development. As the property owner, I'm willing to formalize an arrangement where a portion of Diane's monthly housing payment to me would be directed specifically to repaying your loan. This creates accountability beyond personal intent, a structural solution, with proper oversight. Robert Hargrove leaned forward slightly. You're suggesting some form of garnishment? I'm suggesting a voluntary allocation of funds with contractual obligations, I clarified. Different from garnishment in that it's proactive rather than punitive, but similar in providing assurance that payments will be prioritized. As I outlined the potential structure, drawing on the options Patricia Winters had presented in her office, I could see the conversation shifting from emotional grievance to practical problem-solving. The Hargroves began asking specific questions about terms, schedules, and contingencies. Madison and Brian contributed suggestions about reasonable monthly amounts. Marcus offered insights from his business background about structuring the agreement. What had begun as a confrontation was transforming into a collaborative effort to find a workable solution. The tension in the room gradually dissipated, replaced by the focused energy of people engaged in solving a shared problem. We need to consult our own financial advisor before committing to anything, Robert said finally. But this approach seems more viable than what we've discussed previously. Of course, I agreed. We can provide all the documentation you need for that consultation. And if your advisor has alternative suggestions, we're open to considering them. As the meeting wound down, with tentative next steps agreed upon, I found myself reflecting on how significantly the dynamic had shifted. By approaching the Hargroves, not as adversaries but as stakeholders in a shared challenge, we had opened the door to possibilities that hadn't existed before. After the Hargroves departed, with promises to respond within the week, Madison turned to me with new respect in her eyes. That was impressive, Emma. Where did you learn to negotiate like that? Professional necessity, I replied with a small smile. Architecture involves constant negotiation with clients, contractors, regulatory bodies. You learn to find solutions that address everyone's core concerns. Well, it worked, Brian commented, his relief evident. My parents were ready to pursue the lawsuit to judgment before today. Now they're actually considering alternatives. As we gathered in the kitchen to prepare lunch, a new ease had developed among us. Not quite family comfort, but something warmer than the strained politeness of earlier. Madison and Brian shared ultrasound photos of baby James. Marcus described his new position in Boston. Diane moved among us, contributing to conversations but not dominating them, her relief at the successful meeting evident in her relaxed posture. While helping Diane prepare a salad, I found myself thinking about the resources we had collectively brought to the morning's challenge. My professional negotiation skills, Marcus's business knowledge, Madison and Brian's relationship with his parents, Diane's new commitment to transparency. Each contribution had been essential to creating a potential path forward. Later that afternoon, as Madison and Brian prepared to leave, she pulled me aside for a private word. I had no idea. About the basement, Emma, not really. Mom always made it sound like you preferred being down there, having your own space. I nodded, unsurprised by this confirmation of Diane's narrative control. It's in the past now. Still, she insisted, it wasn't right, and I benefited from it without questioning. She rested her hand on her pregnant belly. Becoming a mother has made me think differently about so many things. About the kind of family I want to create for James. About the values I want to teach him. She looked at me with unexpected vulnerability. I'd like him to know his Aunt Emma, if you're open to that. The offer of connection caught me off guard. For years, I had maintained emotional distance from the twins, seeing them primarily as extensions of Diane, rather than individuals with their own perspectives and potential for relationship. I'd like that too, I said, surprised to find I meant it. After Madison and Brian left, Marcus approached with a similar overture. I'm in town until Tuesday morning. Maybe we could grab dinner tomorrow night? Just the two of us? There's a lot of catching up to do. Again, I found myself nodding, curious about the possibility of a relationship built on present choices rather than past resentments. That evening, as Diane and I reviewed the day's events, she observed thoughtfully, "We found resources today I hadn't even considered." "What do you mean?" I asked, looking up from my notes. When I first faced this crisis, I saw only what I lacked: money, options, solutions. But today showed me that resources aren't just financial. She gestured vaguely around the house. There's knowledge, relationships, perspective, things I couldn't access alone, but that became available when I stopped hiding my problems. Her observation resonated with my own reflections. By expanding our approach beyond Diane's limited options to include multiple perspectives and skills, we had created possibilities that hadn't existed before. That's an important insight, I acknowledged. Solving complex problems often requires resources beyond what any individual can provide. Diane nodded, her expression thoughtful. For years, I tried to manage everything alone. Finances, parenting, maintaining appearances. It was exhausting and, ultimately, unsustainable. She looked at me directly. Today felt different, collaborative rather than isolated. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the unexpected developments of the day. What had begun as a crisis management exercise had evolved into something more profound: a reconfiguration of relationships, a collective approach to problem solving, a tentative exploration of what family might mean beyond biological obligation or legal ties. The basement girl who had once felt excluded from her own family was now at the center of a collaborative effort to create something new from the fragments of the past. There was a certain poetic justice to it, yes, but also a practical wisdom. The resources we needed to address both Diane's immediate crisis and our shared legacy couldn't be found in isolation. They existed in the connections between